In ancient times, long before the rise of Athens or Rome, the island of Crete was home to a remarkable people. They were the first true masters of the sea in human history, and many historians see them as the very first real civilization of Europe. Their ships roamed the waves, their palaces glowed with color, and their culture looked unlike anything around them. Then, almost without warning, their world broke apart. For millennia they vanished into silence, leaving only faint echoes in Greek myth. Today we step into that silence and follow the story of the Minoan civilization. Crete lies at the crossroads of the ancient Mediterranean. If you trace a line from mainland Greece to Egypt, and another from Anatolia to the coasts of the Levant and North Africa, they meet here. That strategic position shaped everything the Minoans would become. Their island stood like a great stone ship anchored in the middle of sea routes that linked Europe, the Near East, and North Africa. Whoever held Crete could watch the movements of traders and warriors. Whoever mastered its coasts could become a power on the water. Minoan history unfolds in 4 broad chapters. Scholars speak of the pre-palatial, proto-palatial, neo-palatial, and post-palatial eras. These labels sound dry, but they trace a dramatic arc. In the first phase, small villages and farming communities spread across the island. In the second, the first great palaces rose and a ruling elite emerged. In the third, Minoan power reached its peak, with art and trade flourishing. In the last, the system broke apart under the stress of disaster and foreign pressure, until only ruins and legends remained. What we now call Minoan is a modern name for this entire story. The lost civilization of Crete stepped back into the light of history in the early 20th century. A British archaeologist, Sir Arthur Evans, began to dig at a low hill near modern-day Heraklion on Crete. Under layers of rubble and earth, he found the sprawling remains of a huge palace at Knossos. Corridors twisted in every direction. Rooms opened into more rooms. Colorful wall paintings showed bulls, dolphins, and elegant figures in bright clothing. Inspired by the myth of King Minos, son of Zeus, and the Phoenician princess Europa, Evans named the builders of this palace the Minoans. What they called themselves, we still do not know. Ancient texts offer scattered clues to that mystery. Egyptian records speak of a sea people called Keftiu. Babylonian and Assyrian sources mention a land named Kaftar or Kaptara. The Mycenaean Greeks, who would later take over Crete, called a group of islanders Kaptai. Even the Bible refers to Kaftar as the ancestral homeland of the Philistines. Linguists suspect that the original self-name of the Minoans may have included sounds like K, P, or F, and T, but the true word is lost. What we have instead is a chorus of foreign names, each a distorted echo of the voices that once rang in the palaces of Crete. Human footprints first touched Crete around 11,000 years ago, when the world was still emerging from the last ice age. For a long time, the dominant theory held that the Proto-Minoans migrated from Anatolia, across the water, to this fertile island. Many historians still favor that view, but growing evidence from paleogenetic research points in a different direction. The people who built the Minoan civilization seem to share deep roots with the earlier inhabitants of Crete. Their genetic profile links them not only to those first settlers, but also to the peoples of the Cycladic culture and to mainland Greece. Rather than a full replacement, it looks more like a long evolution on the same soil. In the earliest days, these Proto-Minoans survived through hunting and gathering, moving with the seasons and the game. About 8,000 years ago, they began to settle more firmly. They cleared fields. They planted oats and wheat. They learned to tend olive trees and vineyards. Sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle grazed on the hillsides. In simple terms, They turned from wanderers into farmers. This change laid the foundation for a stable agrarian society that could store food, support larger families, and free some people from the daily fight for survival. Those freed hands and minds would later build ships, palaces, and works of art. By the early 3rd millennium BC, the Minoans had mastered more than the soil. They learned to work metal, crafting tools and weapons from copper and arsenical bronze. Their pottery became more refined. Painted surfaces showed simple patterns at first, then grew more daring in form and color. These were not just useful containers. They were also symbols of status and skill, traded and displayed across the island. As settlements grew denser in the fertile lowlands, people also pushed into the rugged mountains of Crete. Terraces cut into slopes, houses clung to hillsides, and communities adapted to landscapes that were steep, stony, and hard to tame. From the very beginning, the sea was both a barrier and a highway for the people of Crete. Boats were essential tools. At first, they served for fishing and for short trips between nearby bays. The island's mountainous spine made inland travel slow and exhausting. In many cases, it was easier to push a boat into the water and follow the shoreline than to climb over the ridges. As their skills improved, Minoan sailors went farther. They began to visit the Cycladic islands scattered across the Aegean Sea. These journeys were like training runs for a much bigger project: maritime dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. The true leap came at the turn of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. In this period, change sped up. Settlements expanded quickly, especially at Knossos, Phaistos, Zakros, and Malea. Wealth pooled in the hands of an elite. Social stratification became sharper and more visible. Some families controlled more land, more herds, and more trade than others. They could afford luxury goods and imported treasures. Around them rose larger, more elaborate houses, often linked to storage facilities and workshops. Over time, these clusters grew and fused into vast palace complexes. This was the dawn of high Minoan civilization. Minoan palaces were not simple royal mansions. They were engines that powered the entire system. Within their walls, rulers and administrators managed the flow of goods. Priests performed rituals to secure the favor of the gods. Scribes recorded offerings, rations, and taxes. Artisans worked in attached workshops, turning raw materials into finished products. These complexes served at once as political capitals, religious centers, and economic hubs. Olive oil, wine, grain, textiles, and metal tools all passed through their storerooms, stacked in tall rows of pithoi, the huge jars that still stand in the ruins today. Architecturally, the palaces were sprawling and intricate. Instead of a single block, each site consisted of many buildings grouped around a large rectangular central courtyard. The facades facing outward rose in impressive tiers, with columns, stairways, and balconies. Inside, corridors turned sharply. Rooms opened one into another. Light wells brought daylight deep into the structure. The Palace of Knossos alone covered an area roughly comparable to a modern football field, while the surrounding urban zone stretched for kilometers in every direction. At its height, Knossos may have held many thousands of people within its orbit. The palaces were not only big, they were also technologically advanced for their time. They had carefully planned sewage systems that carried waste away from living areas. Some rooms enjoyed both hot and cold water, delivered by clay pipes. Ventilation shafts cooled the interiors. Multi-story buildings rose above the courtyards, connected by staircases and landings. From an engineering point of view, this was one of the most complex built environments on Earth. To hold their world together, the Minoans also laid down an early network of paved roads. These smooth stone routes, some of the first in Europe, linked the major centers into a single web of movement and control. Shortly before the rise of their first palaces, another innovation unlocked the full power of the Minoan position. Sailors on Crete mastered the use of masts and sails. Their boats changed from simple coastal craft into true seagoing ships that could tackle open water and longer journeys. With these new vessels, Minoan captains extended their reach. They forged trade links with Cyprus, rich in copper, with Anatolia to the north, and with the wealthy cities of the Levant and Egypt to the east and south. The island became a hub where goods, ideas, and people from 3 continents met and mixed, setting the stage for the age of Minoan greatness. To understand how this shining world would one day face disaster and invasion, we first need to see how tightly it was woven together by trade, art, and power. Crete did not sit in isolation. From a very early stage, the Minoans looked outward. Their island had limited oars and stones, but it sat in the middle of sea routes rich in both. As their ships grew larger and more reliable, Minoan captains pushed their prows toward Cyprus, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. Step by step, their shoreline harbors turned into the nodal points of a trading web that linked 3 continents. Crete lacked many key materials, so the Minoans drew them in from afar. From the Levant came agate, onyx, lapis lazuli, and alabaster, stones that glowed with color when polished. From Egypt came amethyst and ivory, precious and exotic. Lead and silver arrived from mainland Greece, tin from as far as the Iranian plateau, and copper from Cyprus, whose very name still echoes in the Latin word for the metal. These materials poured into Minoan workshops, where skilled hands turned raw blocks and ingots into objects that carried the fame of Crete back across the sea. The Minoans paid for these riches with products of their own. Pottery was one of their signatures. They shaped fine vessels with thin walls and graceful curves, then painted them with flowing designs. A distinctive piece was the rhyton, a horn-shaped cup often carved in the shape of an animal's head or a mythical creature. They also exported woolen textiles, intricate jewelry, bronze tools and weapons, carved ivory and amber, and of course wine and olive oil from the terraces and groves of Crete. These goods were not only valuable, they carried a certain prestige. To hold a Minoan cup or wear a Minoan pendant was to display a connection to a powerful island people. At first, the flow of influence was mostly one way. Minoan elites imported luxury items from older centers like Egypt and the cities of the Levant. Art and technology came to Crete along with the goods. But over time, this pattern changed. Minoan craftsmen reached the same level of skill, and then they began to push in new directions. They did not simply copy Egyptian or Levantine models. They developed their own style, especially in jewelry, goldsmithing, engraving, and painted pottery. Across the eastern Mediterranean, frescoes and decorative motifs that carry a Minoan touch appear on the walls of palaces and houses. Even in the royal residences of Egyptian pharaohs at Thebes, archaeologists have found wall paintings that either were made by Minoan artists or imitate their way of seeing the world. Trade did more than spread art. It also carried ideas, tools, and techniques. Contact with the Near East brought advances such as true bronze metallurgy, where copper and tin combined in a more reliable way, and the potter's wheel, which allowed faster and more uniform production of ceramics. Each new method was adopted and adapted on Crete, then woven into the island's own traditions. The result was a culture that felt both connected to its neighbors and distinct from them, a hybrid shaped by constant movement across the sea. This system of exchange rested on a foundation of relative safety. Crete lay some distance from the main power centers of the Near East. The sea that opened it to trade also sheltered it from sudden attack. Combined with a strong navy, This geography gave the Minoans a kind of shield. Ancient Greek writers later described Minoan civilization as a thalassocracy, a maritime empire that used sea power to control other islands and coastal towns. Whether the reality matched the legend in every detail is impossible to say, but there is no doubt that for a long time, Minoan ships dominated key routes in the Aegean and beyond. Yet even the strongest system can be shaken. Toward the end of the 3rd millennium BC and into the 18th century BC, Crete suffered a series of major earthquakes. The island lies in a seismic zone, where tectonic plates grind and shift. At least 4 major palace complexes, along with many surrounding towns and villages, were reduced to rubble. Walls tumbled, storage jars shattered, roofs collapsed onto painted floors. For a more fragile society, this might have marked the end. For the Minoans, it became a turning point. Instead of retreating, they rebuilt. The new palaces were larger, more complex, and more impressive than the old ones. At Knossos, the complex expanded into a true labyrinth of more than 1,000 rooms rising in places to what would feel like 5 modern stories. Corridors, staircases, and light wells multiplied. Storage magazines stretched longer. Workshops became busier. The rebuilt structures show a people not crushed by disaster, but hardened by it, confident in their ability to shape stone and timber into a renewed center of power. This second great building phase belongs to what scholars call the Neo-Palatial period, the high point of Minoan civilization. At this stage, many experts believe that Knossos stood above the rest of the island as the primary seat of authority. Other palaces, such as Phaistos, Zakros, and Malea, likely served as regional centers linked to it. But we should be honest. The exact nature of Minoan governance remains unclear. The ruins speak of bureaucracy and planning, but do not show us a clear throne, a named king, or a list of royal dynasties. One strong argument for some kind of unified state is the absence of evidence for warfare between the major centers. In earlier pre-palatial times, many settlements were fortified with walls and defensive works. In the mature palace period, those walls disappear. The great cities of Crete stand open to the landscape, without massive fortifications. This suggests that internal conflict had been brought under control, perhaps by a central authority that discouraged civil war, or by a shared elite culture that preferred balance and cooperation. The navy, in this view, existed not to fight other Cretan cities, but to police sea routes and deter outside threats. Greek myth offers its own picture. It tells of King Minos, ruling from Knossos, who built a powerful fleet, founded colonies, and swept pirates from the Aegean. Later writers like Herodotus described the Minoans as early masters of the sea. Some modern scholars think that Minos may not have been a single personal name, but rather a royal title like Pharaoh in Egypt or Caesar in Rome. Under this model, many rulers over many generations could have borne the title Minos, giving rise to a blend of history and legend. Other researchers propose a different vision. They note that Minoan art does not clearly show a single dominant male figure in the way that Egyptian art constantly shows the pharaoh. Instead, women appear very often in frescoes and figurines. They are richly dressed, centrally placed, and often associated with ritual scenes. This has led some to suggest that Minoan society may have been matriarchal, or at least that women served both as queens and high priestesses with real political and spiritual authority. In this reading, Crete was not ruled by one great king, but by a network of powerful women whose influence ran through palaces and shrines. Even if this picture is too simple, one fact stands out. Women played a central role in Minoan public life. Artists painted them in fine flounced skirts, tight bodices, and elaborate hairstyles. They appear on balconies, in processions, and in sacred spaces. Men are shown with darker, sunburned skin, a sign that they may have spent more time outdoors, on ships or in military and trading expeditions, while women at home took on key roles in governance and religion. This division of labor would have shaped the rhythms of palace life in ways we can only partly imagine. To manage such a complex society, the Minoans needed writing. By the end of the 3rd millennium BC, they had developed a system known to us as Cretan hieroglyphs, likely inspired in part by Egyptian scripts, but adapted to their own language and needs. Not long after, another script appeared alongside it, the one we call Linear A. For several centuries, both systems were in use, which hints that they served different functions. Perhaps one script was reserved for religious or ceremonial texts, the other for more routine administrative records. Over time, Linear A prevailed and replaced the hieroglyphs. It used a set of around 85 signs, each standing for a syllable or, in some cases, a whole word. Scholars have been able to assign sounds to most of these signs by comparing them with 2 later scripts, Linear B, used by the Mycenaeans, and a Cretan script that remained in use until the 2nd century AD. Where the same sign appears in all 3 systems, it likely carried a similar sound. This allows us to read Linear A aloud, at least partly, turning symbol strings into syllables that sound like da mu ra or pa ito. Yet the language behind those sounds remains unknown. Linear B and the later Cretan script record early forms of Greek. The language of the Minoans was different, probably not Indo-European at all. So when we speak the words of Linear A, we can hear a ghost of the Minoan tongue, but we cannot understand it. The meaning slips through our fingers. We can only guess at what the scribes wanted to say as they pressed signs into wet clay. If Linear A is ever fully deciphered, it would be a historical breakthrough. But we should temper our hopes. The majority of these texts are almost certainly practical documents. They look like inventory lists, ration records, tax notes, and warehouse labels. As Yuval Noah Harari and others have argued, writing in many early societies began as a tool for administration, not for poetry or philosophy. Even so, to read the day-to-day notes of Minoan scribes would bring us closer to the real texture of life in the palaces of Crete. Among all these written traces, one object stands apart like a riddle in fired clay, and it will lead us into the next part of our story. To grasp how such a rich culture could one day crumble under the weight of nature and rising rivals, we first need to walk deeper into its symbols, its gods, and the stories painted on its walls. Among all the written traces left by the Minoans, one object stands apart. In 1908, the Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier was excavating the ancient city of Phaistos on Crete. Beneath the floor of a building, he found a small disk of baked clay, about as wide as a man's handspan and a half, covered on both sides with a spiral band of tiny stamped symbols. This is the famous Phaistos disk. Unlike most inscriptions of the time, its signs were not carved one by one, but pressed into the clay using pre-made stamps. In other words, the disk preserves the earliest known example of printed text in Europe, more than 3,000 years before the age of Gutenberg. The script on the Phaistos disk has never been deciphered. No other long text in the same writing has been found, so scholars have nothing to compare it with. Over the last century, many theories have appeared. Some see a hymn, others a magical spell, a calendar, or a list of warriors. None has won broad acceptance. The most cautious view is that the disk has a religious or ritual meaning. Its find spot, together with caches of burnt bull bones nearby, hints at sacrifice and ceremony. Whatever its true purpose, the Phaistos disk stands as a symbol of the Minoan world itself. Sophisticated, inventive, and still partly hidden behind a veil of mystery. If the texts stay silent, Minoan art speaks loudly. Nowhere is this clearer than in their frescoes. When you step into a reconstructed room from Knossos or Akrotiri, it feels as if the walls have come alive. Painted dolphins leap above your head in blue water. Lilies curl along the lower walls. Processions of men and women move in single file, carrying gifts or leading animals. Unlike many older cultures, the Minoans were not content with simple patterns. They filled their spaces with scenes from daily life, ritual, and nature. These frescoes tell us much about how the Minoans saw themselves. Men are often shown with reddish-brown, sun-darkened skin. Women appear with pale complexions, carefully styled hair, and bright clothes. The contrast is not random. It suggests that men, especially of the elite, spent long days outdoors, at sea or in fields and training grounds, while women occupied more sheltered, but no less important roles in palaces and sanctuaries. Both genders wear jewelry. Both take part in religious events. There is no clear sense that women are hidden away. Instead, they stand at the heart of the visual story. The animal world also plays a strong part. Bulls, dolphins, fish, birds, monkeys, even griffins and other mythical creatures stride across the walls. In some scenes, animals move in their natural setting, with rocks, waves, and plants rendered in flowing lines. In others, they appear beside humans in formal ritual contexts. Minoan artists were among the first in the ancient world to paint pure landscapes that contained no people at all, just rocks, flowers, and birds. This love for the living world hints at a religion and a worldview that saw the divine in nature, not only in distant heavens. Fresco did not decorate only palace walls. Painters covered ceilings, wooden beams, and even floors with color. Early designs used simple geometric shapes and bands. Over time, they grew more complex and narrative, telling stories of festivals, ceremonies, and perhaps legendary events. When fragments of these frescoes turn up in far-flung places, such as palaces in the Levant or at Thebes in Egypt, they show how Minoan art had become a visual brand. Rulers elsewhere either brought Minoan artists to their courts or ordered local painters to imitate the Cretan style, so powerful was its appeal. Minoan religion itself remains hard to reconstruct. No long sacred texts survive, and later Greek myths distort as much as they preserve. Still, patterns emerge from the remains of cult objects, shrines, and images. One key feature is the prominence of female figures. Many small statues and reliefs show women holding snakes, standing on mountain peaks, or flanked by animals. Some of these figures likely represent goddesses, others high priestesses. It is not always possible to tell which is which, and that blurring may be part of the point. The line between human and divine seems thinner in Minoan ritual than in many later systems. A central religious symbol was the double-bladed axe, the labrez. This sign appears carved into stone blocks, painted on walls, and cast in metal offerings. In parts of the Near East, a similar axe was linked to storm gods and thunder. On Crete, it may have carried related meanings of power, sky, and sudden force. Some scholars have even suggested that the very word labyrinth comes from House of the Labres, a memory of a palace filled with these axes, which later storytellers turned into the maze of Minos and the Minotaur. From scattered clues, we can sketch a rough pantheon. There was probably a nature or mother goddess tied to fertility of the land. A mountain goddess received offerings at shrines on high peaks. A snake goddess protected households and livestock. Another figure watched over wild creatures, and at least one deity seems linked to fertility and childbirth. Male gods may have existed alongside them, but the surviving imagery overwhelmingly favors female forms and female authority in sacred contexts. The bull, however, stands out as the most sacred animal. Its strength, size, and dangerous energy made it a fitting symbol of male vitality and divine force. One of the most striking Minoan rituals was tauropkapsia, the bull leaping ceremony. Frescoes show a charging bull, head lowered, horns forward. Before it, a young man or woman seizes its horns, uses the animal's own momentum as a springboard, and flips over its back into a graceful landing. This is not a clumsy struggle for survival. It is a carefully choreographed display of skill and courage. Similar bull-related games and rites appear in other Mediterranean cultures, from ancient arenas to the later corrida in Spain, the running of the bulls in Pamplona, and the courses landaces of southern France. These modern echoes suggest that facing the bull has long been a way for people to test themselves against living power. Half sport, half sacred act. On Crete, bull leaping may have formed part of seasonal festivals that bound elites and commoners together in a shared spectacle. Unlike the great temple complexes of Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Minoans did not build huge freestanding houses for their gods. Instead, they created a web of smaller sanctuaries. Some were built into palace complexes, in rooms decorated with sacred symbols. Others were tucked into caves, perched on mountain peaks, hidden in forest clearings, or placed near lakes. One of the oldest known sanctuaries lay in a cave later associated in Greek myth with the birth of Zeus. These scattered sites allowed people across Crete to participate in cult life without always traveling to the main palaces. For centuries, this system of palaces, shrines, harbors, and trade routes sustained a civilization that seemed to ride above its neighbors on a tide of prosperity. Yet under the surface, it remained vulnerable to forces beyond any king, queen, or priestess. The ground beneath Crete could shake, and the sea that brought wealth could also bring ruin. In the late 17th century BC, the Minoans would learn this lesson in the most violent way possible, when a nearby island tore itself apart in one of the greatest volcanic eruptions in human history.